Hey everybody, welcome to That's Cakeable. I'm Janine and this week I'm showing you how to make this cute guy. So do you remember the last video when I showed you how to make a square, ganache and fondant covered cake? Yeah, well that square little box had a glow up and here he is. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Alright, so you've probably heard me say it about 1 billion times before that all good builds start with a nice solid foundation and structure. So I'm going to show you how I put this structure together. It's very similar to ones I've shown you in the past and it's one of the most simple structures you can put together. Let's do a really quick run through. So for this structure I've got a 12 by 9 inch MDF board that is about 12 millimeters thick. Into that board I've drilled a hole that has to be large enough to fit in my dowel, which is also MDF. Now of course you have to measure the height of your cake to know what height you need the MDF rod at. In the case of my structure, I need it to be about 11 inches long. Now we have to flip our board over. Got a hot glue gun and I'm actually going to attach just another smaller board underneath where the hole is. Now flip the board back over. Using your hot glue again, fill that hole that we've made earlier. And simply pop your dowel straight in. Now of course we need to food safe our structure and I'm going to cover my dowel in some aluminium foil tape. And that is it. That's how we put our structure together and make it nice and food safe. Now that we've done this part, let's start on the cake. Now for the top tier on this cake, which is going to be our head, I have decided to go with a dummy cake. To create the top tier, I took two 6-inch round dummy cakes. One was 3 inches high and the other was 2 inches high. I placed some masking tape on one side of either of those dummies to stop the hot glue from actually melting the styrofoam. I then went ahead and I hot glued them together. After that I used a couple of skewers and I placed them through the center of the dummy cake just to give it that extra security. I then just took some masking tape and wrapped that around the gap between the two dummy cakes. And now the dummy cake is ready to cover. So covering dummy cakes can be a little bit of a challenge at times because they are so light and they like to sort of fly off your bench. But I've implemented a few techniques here that will help you get it covered quite easily. I'm going to start with the top and the bottom of the dummy cake. Firstly, I'll roll out my fondant big enough to make sure that it's going to cover the whole top of the cake. Then, using some clear piping gel, I just attach that to the top of the cake and smooth it down. I then flip the dummy cake over and with a knife, I cut the excess off from the side of the cake. Flip it back up, give it a smooth, and you are done. Of course, you want to go ahead and do that to the other side as well. Now this is where it gets a little bit tricky. We've got to be able to cover the entire side of the cake, so we're using the paneling method. Now I needed to be able to stop my cake from sliding around while I applied the fondant in the center. To do this, I just took a timber board that I attached another foam dummy to that's quite a bit larger than my 6-inch. I placed a skewer in the center of that dummy and basically went ahead and impaled our top tier onto that dummy foam. I placed a non-slip mat underneath that and that will help stop it from sliding around as much. As I did with the top and the bottom of the cake, I gave it a good coat of clear piping gel and after measuring the circumference and the height of the cake, I rolled out a piece of fondant that was long enough and tall enough to wrap around. I took that fondant onto a French rolling pin and very slowly and carefully rolled it around the outside of the cake, smoothing it as I went. When I reached the back and the two pieces had overlapped, I just took a knife and cut a line down that overlap. I removed the excess fondant and then just took my smoother and smoothed that down. I then took a razor blade and very carefully just cut the excess off the top of the cake. Then just go ahead as you do with a normal cake, take your smoothers, in this case I use my flexi smoothers, and smooth it all down. Make sure to smooth the sides of the cake and the top of the cake so that both of those panels adhere to each other really well. Once you've done that, very carefully remove the cake, flip it upside down and tidy up the other end. And there you go, the top tier is now done. Righto, let's move on to assembling this baby. Alrighty, so assembly can sometimes seem a little bit daunting, but it doesn't have to be. Just break it down step by step in your head and it's super simple. That's how I do it anyway, and I find it a lot easier to deal with. So there are a few steps to assembling this cake. The first thing you're gonna need, of course, is that board with that structure that we built. Now, if you're wondering where on earth did she conjure up this base cake from, I can tell you. Just pop over and watch this video right here and I'll show you how to create a beautiful sharp edge square cake. And just don't forget that if you're going to be using it for this cake, to make sure that there is a hole drilled in the bottom of your baseboard. So now I take that base cake and I very gently place it over that center pole that we've made in our board. Now, of course, we're going to need a little bit of support to make sure that that head doesn't sink in to the base tier. It may only be styrofoam, but it's still covered in fondant, so it does have some weight to it. So what I've done is cut out a little bitty cake board that's about 2 inches round, and it's actually going to match up to a little piece of PVC pipe that we're putting in for the neck. Now, of course, because this is going on a cake with a center pole structure, it's also going to need a hole drilled through the center. I place that board over the center pole and just mark out where it sits on top of the cake. I do this so that I can see where I need to put my dowels to support that board. So I remove the board and I just place some thick skewers in as our dowels. Once that's done, I just put a little bit of ganache on there and place that board right back over the top. Now, the PVC pipe I was talking about, I've just taken a bit of hot glue and put it around the rim of that PVC pipe. And I place that sitting on top of the board, not touching cake. Okay, now I decided to decorate this section before placing the head on top, just to make access a little bit easier. So I went ahead, and even though PVC pipe is actually considered food safe, I still added some extra aluminium foil tape just for security purposes. I then took some white fondant and I rolled it out into a very long snake. I covered that PVC pipe area with some piping gel, and with that rope of fondant, I took smaller pieces and started wrapping it around that PVC pipe. I did that until I reached the top. To tidy up the back, I just took another piece of fondant and cut it into a long rectangle, popped that up the back where all the seams were, and then I just used the end of a piping tip to make sort of like rivets, I guess. I then just went ahead with a little bit of silver luster dust mixed with some decorator's alcohol and gave that a paint all over. And now it's time to add the head. So to pop the head on, it's quite simple. Just once again, add a little bit of chocolate ganache on the top of that PVC pipe, and with the round dummy cake that we made a little bit earlier, slide it on top. And that's how you get to this point. Now I think it's time to start adding a few decorations. So let's get on with it. So the first part of the decoration for our robot is just going to entail some bands around the border of the base cake and the top cake. So to keep it super simple, I've just rolled out some white fondant, and then I've taken one of my favorite tools, one of my acrylic rulers, and I've used this to start cutting bands out from the fondant. Starting on the base cake and using vegetable shortening to adhere, because we have to move these around a little bit and vegetable shortening gives us that option, I take my first band and place it on top of the base cake. Then with the help of my acrylic ruler again, I actually just shimmy it up and down to make sure it looks nice and straight. I go ahead and cut more bands and completely frame that front face of the base cake. So where the strips overlap, I just take my craft knife, cut on a diagonal, remove the excess, and then push those stripes back together. Ends up looking nice and clean that way. Of course, I went ahead and did that on all the other 3 sides, as well as on the top of the base tier. For the top tier, it was pretty much the same thing. I just cut out longer strips to make sure that they fit all the way around that barrel shape. Once again, with the help of a bit of vegetable shortening, I just wrapped that around either side of the top tier. And our bands were done. Now all the bands are going to be coloured in silver, so they're going to look a bit like metal. To make sure that the metal looks like it's attached to our robot somehow, I thought we could give it some pop rivets. To make my little pop rivets or screws, I once again rolled out some white fondant, this time a little thicker. Using an 805 piping tip as my cutter, I then cut out small circles from that fondant. I took my craft knife and just made an indent in the center of all those little circles. Then I went ahead with some piping gel and just popped those around on the bands we just created. When I was putting the pop rivets on the top tier, I just used an acrylic ruler as a spacer to make sure that they all looked pretty even. And now they're all ready to paint. And that is that part done. All right, now we've done the beautiful strips and all those little rivets, it's time to put a mouthpiece onto our robot. So the easiest way I find to make like a stencil for this sort of awkward shape is to actually use paper towel. So what I've done is measured out a piece of paper towel to be about the width and height that I want the mouthpiece to be. I pin that onto the robot's head around about where I want it to sit. Then, using a ruler, I mark out where I want the actual mouth to be. I then take that off the robot and set it aside. Now, to make the actual mouthpiece, what I've done is rolled out a piece of white fondant that's big enough to take the actual stencil we've just made. I've cut out that mouthpiece section on the template, and then I place the template on top of the fondant. Using my mini pizza wheel, I just cut around that template. And then for the mouth area, I just score that out with a knife and remove the template. I finish off by making sure that mouth area is completely cut out. Flip it over, give it a little bit of a tidy, and it's ready to put on our bot. To attach the mouthpiece to the robot, I'm once again using some piping gel, and I just place it underneath the robot's head and pop it into place where I want it to sit. Now once it's on and I'm happy with the placement, I then have to go ahead and just give it a bit of a tidy. I do that by just making sure that the mouth line is straight. If it's a little bit off, I just use the blade of a small knife to fix that up. Then on the sides, I just take a knife and cut a nice straight section down each side. To finish the mouthpiece off, I just use a couple of the rivets that I've already made. Ta-da! Mouthpiece is done. Now I'm going to go ahead and make ears. I guess they're ears. To make the ears, I take a half sphere silicone mold. You don't have to use a mold, you can hand mold these yourselves. I just had it there, so I thought I'd use it. I go ahead and fill 2 of the cavities with yellow fondant. I then take some deep red fondant and I roll that out and cut 2 circles just slightly larger than the actual half spheres I've just made. After popping the silica mold into the freezer for about 10 minutes so that I can get them to firm up and not ruin the shape too much when I pop them out, I bring them out and get them ready to go on to the robot. Using the piping gel, I attach the red disc to the side of the robot's head. I then place a skewer through the center of the yellow half sphere and then attach that with the skewer onto the side of the head with a little bit of piping gel. Skewer gives us some added security and you don't have to worry about it because it's going straight into styrofoam. I make sure that I leave a little bit of that skewer hanging out, and on top of that I place a small blue ball of fondant. And that's it, the ears are done. Now before I go on and do any more details on this guy, I'm going to give him a quick dust just to give him a bit of dimension and make him look a little bit worn, dirty, grubby, industrial. That's the word I'm looking for. So I just take some dusting brushes and using a combination of grey and blue petal dust, I just dust over him where I feel he needs dimension. Now that he's all dusted and grubby and industrial, I want to start painting the parts of the robot that are silver. Using some luster dust and some decorator's alcohol, I make some silver paint. Now I've already gone ahead and done all of the strips and rivets on the bottom tier of the cake, and now I'm going to go ahead and do the top. So firstly, I just go ahead and do the entire mouth section, and then just using a strip of paper as a guide so I don't get it all over the place, I go ahead and do the strips and the rivets around the side of the head also. Looking more industrial than ever, I'd say. Okay, so this guy is riding blind currently, so let's give him some peepers. To make our little guy's eyes, we're going to keep it really, really simple. I've rolled out some white fondant and I've cut out 2 circles from that. And then I just roll out some black fondant, roll out 2 smaller circles, and I've decided to make him cross-eyed because why not? So I put the 2 black circles in the 2 white circles, making them cross-eyed. And then I just add 2 little bits of white fondant as catchlights. I attach those to the robot's face with a little bit of piping gel. Eyes on. So to make his little antenna, I rolled out a piece of yellow fondant and cut a circle from that, and place that on the top of his head. Now, initially I decided to use balls on a skewer on top of his head, and then decided later on that I didn't like it and I thought it was too long. So I shortened the skewer and put that through the yellow disc on top of his head. And then I rolled out a snake of yellow fondant and just twisted that around the skewer. On top of that, I popped a little red ball and rolled another thin snake of red fondant and wrapped that around the yellow circle that's sitting on top of his head. I was much happier with that. Then as I stood back and looked at his face, I thought, this could definitely do with some more character. So I went ahead and added a couple of little eyebrows, which were just yellow pieces of fondant rolled into snakes, and a cute little tongue sticking out of his mouth. I know, a robot with a tongue, but hey, it's character. Now I want to make his control panel on his belly. I'm going to make a few little elements for this, so let's get to it. So firstly, I rolled out some white fondant and cut 2 circles out of that, one smaller than the other, and set them aside just to dry for a little bit. I then rolled out some black fondant and cut that into a bit of a rectangle shape. I also set that aside. I rolled out some red, yellow and blue fondant and rolled them pretty thin. Then using my acrylic ruler, I cut small strips out of those colors. Then I took those strips and attached them to the black rectangle at different heights to mimic a bit of a graph. Rolling out some more yellow fondant and some more red fondant, I cut out a few squares and just a couple of little circles for buttons. Now back to those 2 circles I cut out in the beginning. So with the smaller circle, I marked a center point, and then using a black edible marker, I just made points around the outside of the circle, only half of it though. With the larger circle, I went ahead and I painted that silver, and I cut out a circle from the center of it, which is the same size as the circle for the smaller part. Once the edible marker had pretty much dried on the smaller circle, I went back in with a red edible marker and made a small red section on the panel. I rolled out some red fondant and cut that into a really thin triangle, and then placed that into the center. I placed a small ball of white fondant on the end of that and squished it down a little bit and just gave that a hit of silver also. Placing the little one into the big one, I now have a gauge of some sort. A happiness gauge. And now that all the buttons and graphs and gauges are done, it was time to stick them onto my robot's belly. I did that once again with a little bit of piping gel. Okay, so to create this guy's arms, we're using some non-edible materials, however it is food safe. So what I've done is I've taken some 15mm PVC pipe and some 45-degree angle PVC connectors and pop them together. Now to get the measurements for these, it's probably best to actually stand them next to your cake so you can work out where you're going. Now of course I want to cover these in edible materials, so what I do is I go ahead and I roll a really long snake of white fondant. I make sure that it's quite thick. Now I have my PVC pipe and my PVC elbows sitting on top of just a couple of dowels in a styrofoam dummy. This will just help to secure them while I cover them. I cover the pipes with some piping gel and then I start wrapping snakes of fondant around the PVC. Sort of like little donuts all the way up. Once I get to the connector area, I just make sure that my fondant snake is a little bit thinner, but I don't go up all the way. Of course, I go ahead and do that twice. Once they're all covered, I just take some of my silver luster dust paint and give them both a once over. Now to connect them to the cake, I decided to use a couple of skewers just to secure them on the side while I was working. So I put the skewers in either side of the cake. On top of them, I place the now covered PVC pipe. You can give them a bit of a nudge into the cake to make sure that they don't go anywhere. Like I said, they are classified food safe as our water does run through them, and I make sure that I clean all my PVC pipes before putting them onto cake. I roll out a snake of red fondant and use that to secure the PVC pipe to the body of the robot, sort of like his shoulder. I then roll out a snake of yellow fondant and place that right next to the red piece. And then to finish off the shoulder area, I roll a piece of blue fondant into literally a teardrop shape. I put the tip of the teardrop at the front of the arm, so it's sitting between the silver and the yellow fondant. And then I wrap that around the rest of the shoulder. I cut the excess off the back, smooth it out, and that part of the arm's done. Now I didn't do it on film, but of course you can go ahead and make a strip of fondant and place it at the back of the arm to tidy it up, just like we did with the neck. Now of course he's got arms, but now he needs some hands. To make the hands, I rolled out some blue fondant and made sure that it stayed nice and thick. I then cut the blue fondant into two even size rectangles, propped them up on their side and curved them around. I just attached them to the arms with a little bit of piping gel and his hands were done. Now the legs were very similar to the arms. The only thing is that I didn't actually use elbow connectors for the legs. So I've taken my PVC pipe and I've measured how long I want the legs to be, made a mark on the pipe, and then with my pipe cutters, cut the lengths accordingly. Two of those also. I supported the PVC pipes the same way I did with the arms, making sure that I'd covered the pipe in piping gel. I rolled out another snake of white fondant that was a little thicker than what I used on the arms, and went ahead and did exactly the same process. Once they were covered, I painted them silver also. Now that they're all painted, it was safe for me to add just one more piece. I rolled out a thin yellow snake of fondant and just popped that right near the end. And just be sure to leave a little bit of the pipe exposed so you've got somewhere to put his feet. Now with the legs, I made sure that I cut the back of those little donuts that we built up so that it was nice and flat at the back and would sit flush against the board. To attach the legs, just pop them against the cake where you would like them and give them a little bit of a nudge. If you wanted to add a little bit of piping gel underneath the legs or some water, it would help secure it even further. And finally, for his feet, I just took a piece of red fondant and rolled it into an oval shape. I flattened it down and used my smoothers to make sure either side was nice and even. I then just went ahead and cut that in half. To secure his feet, I just popped them on the end of that exposed bit of pipe I left at the end. I then just used my smoothers and a blade to make sure that they were nice and tidy. And that, guys, is it. That's how you make this cute little robot cake out of the awesome square cake that we made in my last video. And don't forget, of course, you could make him any color or give him any expressions you wanted to make this more personalized. Well guys, I hope you really enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, please don't forget to give it a like, thumbs up, And if you haven't already, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so you're informed every time I upload a new video. Now I guess I better think of a name for this guy. I'm sorry, what was that? Oh, apparently his name's Dave. Well, Dave, it's time for you and I to sign off now. But these guys, it's time for you to go and get your cake on. See you guys.